The scramble for Africa was one of the most dramatic and consequential episodes in modern history, shaping the fate of an entire continent and leaving behind legacies that remain deeply felt today. It was a period stretching from the late 19th century into the early 20th, in which European powers, driven by ambition, competition, and economic desire, sought to seize and control virtually the entire African continent. Before this scramble, Africa was not an uncharted or empty land, but a place of ancient civilizations, sophisticated kingdoms, empires, and trading networks. However, in the minds of the European colonial powers, Africa represented both an opportunity for expansion and a canvas on which they could impose their own political and economic designs. The roots of the scramble lay partly in centuries of earlier contact. Since the 15th century, Europeans had established trading posts along Africa's coasts, engaging in commerce for gold, ivory, and, most infamously, enslaved human beings. The Atlantic slave trade devastated societies across West and Central Africa, stripping millions of people from their homelands and reshaping demographic and political dynamics. Yet throughout this period, Europeans generally remained confined to the coasts. As African polities were powerful, disease environments were harsh for foreigners, and technological limitations restricted penetration into the interior. Africa was, for Europeans, a place of profit and commerce rather than direct territorial conquest. That reality began to shift in the 19th century with changes in technology, ideology, and global geopolitics that set the stage for a land rush unlike any seen before. By the early 19th century, the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade began to transform Europe's economic interest in Africa. Britain, having outlawed the slave trade in 1807, sought new commercial opportunities in legitimate commerce: palm oil, groundnuts, cotton, and other raw materials useful for industrialization. At the same time, missionaries from Britain, France, and Germany saw Africa as fertile ground for spreading Christianity, often portraying their work in terms of a civilizing mission. Explorers such as David Livingstone, Henry Morton Stanley, and Mungo Park brought back detailed accounts of Africa's rivers, resources, and societies, fueling European imaginations. Reports of fertile lands, mineral wealth, and navigable waterways whetted the appetites of industrial nations hungry for raw materials and markets. Another key development was the Industrial Revolution. Industrial capitalism demanded raw materials, markets for manufactured goods, and opportunities for investment. Europe's growing factories consumed cotton, rubber, copper, and other resources in staggering quantities, and Africa seemed to offer abundant supplies of these. At the same time, advances in medicine, particularly the use of quinine against malaria, reduced the dangers that had long deterred Europeans from venturing inland. Steamboats allowed easier navigation of great rivers like the Niger, Congo, and Nile, while new weaponry such as repeating rifles and machine guns gave European armies devastating superiority over African forces. These changes made the conquest of African territories militarily and logistically feasible in a way it had not been before. Ideology played its part as well. Nationalism surged across Europe in the 19th century, and empires were seen as symbols of national prestige. To possess colonies was to demonstrate a nation's power and importance on the world stage. France, humiliated by defeat in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71, sought to restore its glory through expansion overseas. Germany, newly unified under Otto von Bismarck in 1871, sought colonies to establish itself as a global power, though Bismarck himself was initially skeptical of colonial adventures. Belgium, under King Leopold II, sought prestige for a small nation through overseas dominion. Britain, with the largest empire in the world, was determined to maintain its supremacy and safeguard its roots to India. These rivalries created a competitive atmosphere in which no nation could afford to be left behind. The spark that set the scramble into motion came largely from the ambitions of King Leopold II of Belgium. In the 1870s, Leopold employed the explorer Henry Morton Stanley to establish a presence in the Congo Basin under the guise of philanthropy and scientific exploration. In reality, Leopold envisioned a personal empire that would enrich him through control of the Congo's vast resources. His activities alarmed other European powers, who feared they might be excluded from Central Africa. The result was a rush by multiple nations to stake claims before rivals did. This growing rivalry culminated in the Berlin Conference of 1884 and 85, a meeting convened by Bismarck to regulate European competition in Africa and prevent conflict among the powers themselves. No African representatives were invited. The continent's fate was decided entirely by outsiders. The conference established principles for partition, such as the doctrine of effective occupation, meaning that a power could not simply claim territory, but had to demonstrate some administrative or military presence. Boundaries were drawn on maps with little regard for existing ethnic, linguistic, or political realities. The Congo was formally recognized as Leopold's personal domain, the Congo Free State, though it was anything but free for the millions of Africans who would be subjected to forced labor, brutal punishment, and widespread atrocities under Leopold's rule. After Berlin, the scramble intensified. Britain expanded aggressively in the north and south, seizing Egypt in 1882 to protect the Suez Canal, which was vital to its Indian Empire. From Egypt, Britain sought to extend control southward through Sudan, and eventually to link up with its colonies in southern Africa. Cecil Rhodes, a fervent imperialist, dreamed of a continuous line of British territory from Cape to Cairo. In southern Africa, Britain clashed with both Afrikaner settlers, the Boers, and African kingdoms such as the Zulu, ultimately imposing control after prolonged wars. France, meanwhile, advanced from its bases in West Africa, pushing eastward toward the interior, while also consolidating holdings in North Africa, including Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco. By the 1890s, French territory in Africa stretched in a vast belt across the continent from the Atlantic to the Red Sea. Germany, a relative latecomer, acquired colonies in modern-day Tanzania, Namibia, Cameroon, and Togo, though it lacked the experience and naval reach of Britain and France. Portugal, with older claims dating back to the 15th century, retained Angola and Mozambique, though its control there was often tenuous. Italy sought colonies as well, seizing Eritrea and parts of Somalia, but its imperial ambitions were checked by the unexpected defeat at Adwa in 1896, when Ethiopian forces under Emperor Menelik II decisively crushed an Italian army. Ethiopia thus preserved its independence, one of only two African states, along with Liberia, to avoid colonization during this period. The partition of Africa was marked by both rivalry and negotiation among Europeans. Tensions came to a head in incidents such as the Fashoda Crisis of 1898, when British and French forces confronted each other in Sudan. War was narrowly averted, but the episode demonstrated how Africa had become a stage for European power struggles. By 1914, with the exception of Ethiopia and Liberia, the entire continent had been divided among European empires. The map of Africa had been redrawn, with borders that often cut across ethnic and cultural lines, grouping diverse peoples together under foreign rule. For Africans, the consequences were profound. Colonization meant the loss of political sovereignty, as traditional rulers were displaced or subordinated to colonial administrations. Economies were reoriented to serve European interests, with forced labor, taxation, and the cultivation of cash crops replacing local subsistence systems. Railways, roads, and ports were built, but largely to facilitate extraction of resources rather than to benefit Africans themselves. Resistance erupted in many regions. The Herero and Nama peoples in German Southwest Africa revolted in 1904, only to face genocidal repression. Samurai Touré in West Africa waged long campaigns against the French. The Zulu and Ndebele resisted British encroachment in southern Africa. Though often valiant, these resistances were generally overwhelmed by European firepower. Culturally, colonialism imposed new languages, religions, and educational systems. Missionary schools spread literacy, but also sought to instill European values and undermine indigenous traditions. Europeans often justified their rule through paternalistic ideologies, casting Africans as childlike peoples in need of guidance. This rhetoric of the white man's burden masked the exploitative realities of colonialism, in which millions of Africans were coerced into labor on plantations, in mines, and in construction projects. The scramble for Africa also reshaped global geopolitics. The possession of African colonies became points of pride and bargaining chips in European diplomacy. They contributed to rivalries that would eventually culminate in the First World War, when colonial troops and resources were mobilized on a massive scale. For Africa itself, the colonial borders and systems established during the scramble laid the groundwork for many of the political challenges that emerged after independence in the mid-20th century. Artificial boundaries grouped together disparate communities, fueling tensions that in some cases persist to the present day. In retrospect, the Scramble appears as both a high point of European imperialism and a catastrophe for Africa. It represented the collision of European ambition with African realities, in which the continent's people had little voice over their destinies. Yet, despite the overwhelming power of the colonial project, Africans did not passively accept domination. Resistance, adaptation, and survival characterized their responses. The memory of these struggles would later fuel nationalist movements that swept the continent in the 20th century, bringing an end to colonial rule. The story of the Scramble is therefore not just about maps drawn in European capitals, but about the lives of millions who endured its consequences and who shaped, in ways large and small, the history of modern Africa. It is a story of greed and violence, but also of resilience and continuity, as African societies navigated one of the most disruptive periods in their long and complex histories.